We're really happy to be here, especially also thanks to Mad, the Jockey Club, and Good Lab for having us, because we're really excited about this. So we're going to talk a bit about our social lab that we're going to do here in Sham Shui Po. And we actually kind of feel at home because, you know, everything's orange. So we're really happy, actually. We just arrived and we feel at home already. So my name is Wieteke, this is Jos. And I would like to start with a story about Nino and his friend Danny. And Nino has a chip card for public transportation, like the octopus card that you have here. And it's a personal card. And you have to sign up for it, but somehow he tried it a few times and it doesn't work. And that seems kind of exemplary for Nino's life, because at age 23, he signed up in all sorts of systems that he doesn't want to be in. And he's not signed up in systems that he wants to be in. So from the municipality to debt collecting agencies, he's not in systems that he needs to be in. And Nino is in serious debt now, and he doesn't know what to do anymore. And his friend Danny, he tells him, Nino, maybe you should commit a crime, because, you know, if you go to prison, then eventually people are going to help you with your problems, and nobody is going to help you here. And this is a real story from Dordrecht, where we work in a social lab. So this is Nino, and his friend says, you know, maybe you should commit a crime, because nobody is willing to help you right now. And if you go to prison, people will help you.
All right, the next two people we'd like you to meet are Anna and Lucia. They are both two policy professionals in Amsterdam, and they work at the local government in Amsterdam at the Department of Work and Income. That's a separate department in our government. And they both participated in our social lab that we ran in Amsteldorp, which is a suburb in Amsterdam. You might have read about it in our latest paper. We wrote a few things about it in the field guide as well. When they started talking to people on the streets in our lab, they didn't feel really comfortable doing that, because normally in their own work, the people they meet them at their office, and they ask them only questions, closed-end questions about their income or about their work. They basically use a questionnaire. And in the lab method, we obviously ask really open questions. So people started to talk to them about lots of other stuff than work and income, because obviously for people, there's lots of topics connected to work and income that aren't asked about in a questionnaire. So I had quite a hard time talking to people on the street. And people on the street had a hard time talking to them. And you see this quite often in the Netherlands, that they make policies, they divide people's lives into separate units. Like you have a piece that's called work, you have a piece that's called income, you maybe have a piece that's called housing. Whereas in the real life, all these pieces, all these topics are obviously way more connected. And even in Holland, you have every piece, every topic has its own governmental department. The next people would like you to meet are Hannah and George. Hannah is a policymaker in Amsterdam, and she's really dedicated to help people who need the governmental services the most. But she has quite a hard time finding the people that need it the most, because most of the time those people, they don't want to be in need of the government, or they don't have a big social network to reach out to the government. We call those people the invisibles, or the unusual suspects. And this guy, he's called George, and he works as a local maintenance guy for the local housing corporation. But in reality, his job feels way more like he's a social worker. Because when he fixes all the houses in the neighborhood, he knows everyone in the neighborhood. He knows every unusual suspect that Hannah can't find. So we brought those people together in our social lab, because you see quite often that the Hannahs and the Georges of the world, they don't know each other, whereas if they would, they could help lots of more people. These are maybe three small stories, and they might not relate necessarily to the local context here in Hong Kong, but these stories show a few disconnects between what we call, well, the reality of people's lives and the system world. And with system world, we mean local institutions, organizations, NGOs, the local government, basically like the formal network. And in these stories, you saw a gap between what the system can deliver and what people might want from the system. And sometimes you even see disconnects between what people say that they want and what they do. Because some people, they said to us, oh, yeah, I'm in need of help, but they don't actually reach out to get help. So you have all these kinds of disconnects, and those disconnects are most of the time the starting point in our work at Kennisland. Finding these disconnects and together with every stakeholder around those disconnects to bridge them actually and to help closing the gap.
Okay, so for the next 40 minutes or so, we will be talking about how to close the gaps or how to make the gaps smaller at least. So first we will tell you something about Kennisland, so Knowledge Land, where we both work. And then we will ask you, or we will talk about the question where to start, because that's a question that we often get when you're working on such big problems, major problems, like where do you start? And then we will tell you something about social labs, obviously, as a vehicle for change. And we will talk about the feed-forward methodology that we use within the social labs. And then, after all that, we will tell you something about the lab sprint that we're going to conduct here. So, about wicked problems. A wicked problem, we would say, is a messy problem, a thick problem, a problem that has multiple causes and you don't know really where it starts and you don't really know where it ends. And it also has multiple stakeholders. So in comparison to a traditional problem where you have a cause and one stakeholder and an end, wicked problems are much more complicated, and it's hard to find the problem holder, and also people might not even perceive the problem the same way. So what are you going to do about a problem that some people don't even perceive as a problem? What we do at Kennisland is we work on those wicked problems.
Yeah, maybe to add a bit on that, the funny thing about wicked problems is that you see quite often that systems that create those wicked problems are also the systems that try to solve the wicked problems, which obviously doesn't work.
Okay, so at Kennisland, we work with, these are our co-workers actually, so you can meet them all a bit. And Kennisland is a think and do tank for societal renewal. And what we try to do is to work on those wicked problems. So we will try to find ways to solve the wicked problems. And we do that together in different departments. So we work on in the cultural sector, we work on governmental issues, and we also work on, for example, in the education field. And Jos and I are both working in the social innovation field of Kennisland. So this is our motto, you could say. And the starting point in all of our work is actually the field, the citizens. And we would like to think that if you invite citizens to share their own unique piece of knowledge that we think everybody has, you could bring new sorts of change about. So if we bring everybody together in new ways, you can think maybe that you can start collecting new perspectives on wicked problems and together try to solve them.
And this is actually what we would call social innovation, because that's a term that's used quite often, and everyone has their own understanding of the term, and this is what we think about when we think about social innovation. Yeah, and as Wieteke said earlier, oh right, this is my timeout, so I don't get like arm problems while typing. So we gotta wait for 15 seconds, but I'll just talk through it. Okay, no matter. People often ask us, okay, where to start when you try to bring about social change, right? And here we have 3 different starting points that we're going to talk about a bit in the next few slides. This one is actually, we start inside the system. We start by changing policy. This one, we start with professionals in the system, try to empower them. And the last one is really when you start with the end users or with the citizens outside the system and try to bring about change, starting talking to them. So the first one, starting with policy. When we were founded in 1999, we like to think that as long as we change policy, or as as long as we can bring about change or a shift in policy, that's the way to go if you want to work on societal renewal. Eventually, that will lead to a change in the daily lives of people. And we were quite successful at some points. For example, we worked quite a bit on the reform of copyright. We were in Holland. We are well known for our work at Creative Commons. You might have heard about that if you're a designer or an art student. We're still using lobbies and in Brussels, for example, if we work on big European projects or write reports. But on the other hand, we see that it takes quite a long time to get into effect of the daily lives when you only change policy, right? And it's sometimes a quite tiresome process as well. So then we thought maybe we can start by supporting professionals in the system, for example, a group of teachers or a group of government professionals, bring them together, create a network, and try to learn them, well, from each other, because they all have plentiful knowledge, and try to teach them new ways of innovation as well. And this works for some parts. We feel that they can do the work better now, but still the question, what do the end users see as a result of this? Well, still unanswered sometimes. So then we decided, okay, let's talk first to what we call end users. And end users is basically anyone who uses a service that a system provides. I mean, a student or a pupil is the end user of the education system, whereas we as citizens are the end user of a governmental system. So everyone in this room is an end user in his own terms, right? And we talk to them and we try to learn them how to be their own change agent. And this led to quite a bit of commitment with them, and they felt they could really change something in their lives. But we also found that quite often people really don't care that much about policy. I mean, they would like a job, but they don't care about the policy around job. Or local people, young people might want a place to hang out in the neighborhood, but they don't care who provides that place. So we found that while this still works to change their daily lives, it doesn't lead to a better practice of public professionals, and it doesn't lead to policy as well. So then we thought, all right, if we're going to try to solve problems the same way we were doing right now, we'll be getting the same results. We need new ways of innovation, new ways of bringing about social change. And we kind of summarize that as we need more social R&D, where we borrowed the term R&D from the technological field, which stands for research and development, because we found that big companies were spending so much of their revenue on building and trying and testing to find out new products, new markets, and we figured, yeah, we need that too in social innovation as well. And we saw kind of a shift in thinking that led to seeing the community more as a networked community, and we defined a few principles that we think will help to in the social R&D to help create new knowledge together, new ways of innovation. So these are some four principles. We talk a bit about them when we discuss the labs. So basically our next step is to still start with the end users, but not only stick to them. You should take along the public professionals in your story. You should eventually try to get policy officials at the beginning to create commitment on all levels in order to really bring about social change and to really create a space where all those layers, policy, practice, and people can work on a new understanding of the problems and eventually to new types of solutions for problems.
Okay, so we thought if we would like to have more social R&D, how are we gonna do it? How are we gonna do it ourselves? And then we came up with the social lab approach. So there are a lot of different social labs actually around the world, and we're gonna tell you something about what we do as Kennisland, which doesn't mean that every social lab has to be the same around the world, but this is our approach. So a social lab We see it as a space for experimentation, for reflection, where policymakers, as well as researchers, students, and of course citizens can get together and seek out where challenges lie, and also find new ways of collaboration during the experiment. So there will be new conversations between people that haven't met each other before, and they will see each other's perspectives on different problems, and we think that that is one of the most important parts of a social lab. And the idea actually is that a social lab doesn't last forever, and it is preferably actually if it doesn't, because you don't want the lab to be a new institute in itself. You just want it to be a facilitating room for experiment, actually. And we started here in Amsteldorp, which is a suburb of Amsterdam, and we tried to come up with a new methodology on how to do a social lab, and we call it Feed Forward, and I will tell you something about that later. But first, we will look at what, in our eyes, makes a social lab a good social lab. And we would like to start with the team, because that's one of the most important things in a lab. So we need a team that's multidisciplinary, a team that consists of policymakers, of officials, of normal citizens, of students, of people from welfare organizations. Actually, anyone you can think of that wants to have a share in how to solve a problem. And also, you can see us here sitting outside in Amsteldorp. The idea is that a social lab is based on immersive learning. So you don't sit behind your desk, because that's not where you're going to get to talk to people. You really have to dive into it to see what's going to happen. So for the second part, if you have a team, what are you going to do with a team? Of course, you don't want to, as I said, sit behind your desk and wait until somebody's going to come up to you and tell you their story. No, you want to be outside. So what you do is you make an office either in the research area, or what we did was actually we put a few benches outside and sat outside, and that was what we called our office. We had a little sign, "Welcome to Amsteldorp. We are Team Amsteldorp."
We were lucky because there were the only 2 weeks in Holland that actually it wasn't raining. So we could sit outside, yeah.
Yeah. In comparison to here, though, we will see how the weather's going to be. But yeah, we could sit outside, and what you saw was that people actually became curious. Like, what are you doing in our square? Like, you're sitting there with benches. What are you doing? What are you doing in our neighborhood? And what do you want to do for our neighborhood? And it was actually funny because one night we left the benches outside on purposely. And when we came back, we saw that people started to use them as a way to be able to chat with each other, just because they didn't have space to chat with each other before. So it's also, you don't know what to expect sometimes. We didn't know that they would be sitting out there, but when we came back, they were. And that's one of the really nice parts of a social lab. You see that if you create a space where people can get together, most of the time, they also will.
All right, yeah, so the next key ingredient of a social lab, you might have read about it a bit in the field guide as well, that we think that stories are really a vehicle to bring about social change. In addition to using statistical data and quantitative data, but stories really, well, they literally show you a face behind a number. Because sometimes a number can be really insightful, but they don't show you what's the reason behind the number, what's the cause of someone being homeless, for example. And we think stories are powerful in a couple of ways. The first way is that stories can tell you a bit about what we call local intelligence. So if you read a story of someone, you can really learn something about a new world, and you get new insights in someone's life that you couldn't think of yourself. And the story may even ask you questions that you didn't think of before, or maybe answer questions or open totally new doors in someone's life that you couldn't have asked without reading that story, without knowing someone's life story. The second reason stories are powerful is when, for example, when I would read a story of someone else, it can change my assumptions, or it can change my the things I would take for granted, for example. And in that way, a story can be used as a tool for evaluation together with the whole group. So these, oh well, there we go again. You can relax now for 15 seconds maybe, have a small break. And I'll just go to the next slide. So we'll be talking about stories quite a lot the coming week, and obviously that's one of the main parts we're going to do is collect stories together, interpret stories together. And stories can really be, in addition to other data that we have, a really powerful tool to bring about social change. So this is actually on the square where we had the benches as well. We just put down all the stories, so everyone involved, all the policymakers, the citizens, everyone who's part of the lab team, they could read all the stories and together evaluate the common threads in the stories. And this is actually a really big part of the social lab, that we try to be as open and as inclusive as possible. So for example, in Amsterdam, we started with maybe 6 or 7 team members, and then during the week, the curious citizens came to us and they wanted to be a part of the team as well. So when you're doing a lab, you've got to be as open and inclusive as possible. And this also means that all the stories we write, we will publish them online on our Medium blog. We'll tell you a little bit about that later. Obviously, all are anonymously and only after we get consent of the people we interview. But everything will be online. In this way, it creates an ongoing conversation between either like the policymakers, the citizens, and the end users. And we found that this collaborative talk is often missing in policymaking. It's important to note that a lab doesn't necessarily provide with definitive solutions. A lab is a temporary space where everybody involved, all the stakeholders, they can together design, iterate, and evaluate possible directions of solutions, right? So no definitive solution, but possible directions of solutions. And by doing that together, you create commitment from the start, because quite often you see that a team of policymakers or just one team of one group of stakeholders, they design something for someone else, and for an end user, for example. And the end user might be in need of using that system, but not necessarily the product that is designed for him instead of with him. So in a lab we try to design, iterate and test by using prototypes and lots of other stuff from the design world to really test real quickly which principles behind ideas work and which don't. And in our view, the work of a lab is done when when the teams behind the lab, they can independently continue working with these ideas and maybe doing a pilot or maybe scale up the ideas, then the work of a lab is done in our eyes.
Okay, so now I'll tell you something about the feed-forward methodology that we use. And actually, feed-forward is based on collecting, organizing, and interpreting stories that are going to be used as feedback for future actions. And that's why we call it feed-forward. So this is the whole process. I hope that you can read it because the letters are kind of small, but we'll see. I'll guide you through. And during the whole feed-forward process, we ask every team member to write blogs. And the idea is that these blogs are going to be publicly available so that you can see different perspectives from everyone on the things that happen during the feed-forward steps. So we will have citizens as well as researchers, as well as officials, and as well as other people all write blogs on what they see and on what they hear. So you will have like a huge color palette, I think so, on what is happening and which perspectives there are. Okay, now, sorry, this slide is in Dutch actually, and I don't expect you to understand it, but I'll guide you through. We will start at the preparations because the idea is that, as I told you before, we need a good lab team, and we also need to learn something about the local context, and that's why we're really happy that there's going to be another few presentations about Sham Shui Po here. Because if we don't know what's happening already a bit, it's really hard to start somewhere. Like, who are you going to talk to? Who are you going to meet? So most of the time we use statistical data to have some kind of view on what's happening in the area. And that's when we can formulate an open question that we will talk about during the lab. So these preparations are really important before you go outside. And the first step of Feed Forward is the collection, the interpretation, and the sharing of the stories. And the idea is, as I said, that we will do that all together as a lab team. So we will go outside and talk to citizens and see what their stories are. And after that, if the same common threads are starting to occur, that's usually around 20 stories, we will have collected enough to go on. And the idea is that if you have collected 20 stories, or a bit more or a bit less, we will see the common threads. So the idea is that we will invite everybody that wants to during a collaborative evaluation, so they can share their thoughts on what they read in the stories and already look for some maybe hidden ideas that are laying in the stories that might be ways for solutions already.
So maybe one example, if you talk to a citizen here in the neighborhood and he or she talks a bit about the housing corporation or about social housing, we try to invite the people that are mentioned in the story, in this example from the housing corporation, to come with us to check their part of the story, because they're mentioned on one side of the story, but they might perceive it not as a problem, or they might have their own opinions about it. And by bringing those stories together and bringing the people behind the stories together, you can get a shared and better understanding of each other's perspectives.
Yes, and that's also what we try to do in the second step of Feed Forward. So what we want to do is when somebody tells you a story about, for example, a housing company in Holland, we've had it a few times, or a story about the police, you actually go with them to see what's happening. So you take a citizen, go to the police station, and ask them, okay, what has happened? What are we going to do? And how would you normally have your procedures go to see how the citizen and the police officer interact or do not interact with each other. And maybe it's also good to know that here, obviously, in Sham Shui Po, we don't have that much time, so we will merge some things together. For example, the collecting of the stories is going to take us 2 days, but the collective evaluation will be merged with another one. So we can have all the stakeholders together at one day. So we will have them read the stories, and hopefully they will also read our blog, but you can't be sure about that. So we will hang them on the walls here. They can read them. We can talk to them about the stories, and they can share their thoughts on the stories, whether they perceive things as a problem or whether they don't. And afterwards, in that collective evaluation, we will already start thinking about ideas and ways to solve maybe the problems that citizens are having. Because as you can see, normally we have another collective evaluation after the collection of stories again, but it's too short of a time span to do that here. The third step is to generate a collaboration. And what we actually want to do is, when we're having this collaborative evaluation, ideas might pop up about how to make a change or how to change things. And it doesn't have to be like a whole new idea. It actually is preferable if you go with what's already there. I mean, there are a lot of welfare organizations that try to do many great things. And obviously, everybody has their own kind of knowledge about what needs to be done. So if there are a lot of good things happening already, you can alter them a bit, maybe change them a bit to see if things start working as you want them to. So this is actually the part that we would call the prototyping. So here we're gonna work on the ideas and see if they might work in real life. So we'll come up with little prototypes. It can even be a storyboard. It can be a paper thing. We go outside and check with citizens if they think that those prototypes might work in real life.
And maybe to add one funny thing, that in Holland we have so many welfare organizations, so many system institutions, and you often think that to change something you need to get more services or more products, but sometimes it might be really helpful to cut back on a few of those. So that's funny that when we're doing a lab in Holland, sometimes an answer could be to just get rid of some of the institutions. And that's always interesting to talk with them, obviously, about such topics. But we might see what happened here.
Okay, so the last step is about, okay, Jos, there's your timeout thingy again, but we'll work it through. The last step is about letting the lab go. So the idea is that if citizens and policymakers and welfare organizations and researchers all together made prototypes, there's a good foundation upon which can further build. And the idea is that they will together make those prototypes into real solutions. So as a lab team, actually, what you want to do is you want to just facilitate the process of letting them make their own solutions, instead of you being the person that is going to create those solutions, because you are going to be gone in a few weeks, months, or here in a few days. And you actually want those solutions or ways to solutions to stay here while you're gone. So the idea is that you're just a facilitator in the process of making those solutions work. Okay, so I hope that wasn't too much for you. We'll talk about the results that we expect. The idea is that there are going to be results on 3 levels. First of all, of course, there are going to be results, or we hope to have results for citizens. There are going to be new interactions, new possibilities, and hopefully new insights for them. And also, we want to have results that are useful for the system. And lastly, we will, of course, and that's maybe the biggest part of the Social Lab Sprint here, for you as participants to see how a social lab works and how it could or could not work here in Hong Kong would be one of the most important results of the lab sprint that we're going to have.
And obviously we will talk about every step in the feed forward methodology in the coming workshops in the following week. All right, while doing a lab, this all sounded a bit theoretical, I can imagine. There are also quite a few pitfalls that you have to take into account before starting a lab. Wieteke already shared the first one, that you should be careful that a lab is not going to be another institution. It should be a temporary space. Sometimes you see that while everybody's so busy in a lab, it can take too long and you get another institute in itself. So that's something to be careful about. But we obviously won't have that problem here because we're here for only 8 days. The second pitfall is that scaling is really difficult. We might propose new ways of solution. We prototype them, we test them. We might even do a small pilot, I don't know yet. But scaling is always really hard. We should take that into account. And that's why we are real glad you're all here today from the start. And we try to let all the stakeholders participate as early as possible in order to create maximum commitment from the start. And another pitfall, I lost that one. Can you maybe check it on there?
Yes, I think the last pitfall is, it is like that if you act like politics are non-existent in a social lab, it is really hard to make it work. So you're doing a social lab in the real world, and you have to deal with all kinds of politics that are present in the real world. So we can make, like a little playground, but in the end, the little playground has to work also in the real life.
Yeah. Thank you. Then a few dilemmas, because we like to be honest about doing a social lab. It's not always easy. A few dilemmas that may arise, maybe the first one is that you can have a difference in culture. And by culture, I mean a difference in ways of working. For example, the first story I shared from Anna and Lucia, they had such a different culture in working with the governmental department of work and income. While in the lab, they had to do open interviews, and they weren't quite sure yet what would come out of it. So it takes a while to teach people in a lab the new ways of working. So that's really good why we're doing a really immersive and pressure cooker lab sprint here. So we got time for it, but that's one thing to think about before organizing a lab. And the second one, which is really interesting for us right now being here in Hong Kong, is cultural differences, because so far we only organized the labs in Holland. And we know a little bit how it works now in Holland, but obviously we really have no idea yet what will happen next week here in Hong Kong. So this is as much a learning experience for us as it is for all of you, hopefully. So we're really looking forward and excited to see whether our approach here works or it may not work. We'll find out about that. And we are continuously evaluating our own methodology as well. It's not a fixed thing to feed forward. It changes over time with new insights that we get, especially from the chance we get now to do it here in Hong Kong. That's amazing for us at Kennisland. And the third dilemma is that you deal with real people. You don't deal with test subjects. They're all real people. So it might happen that some ethical dilemmas may arise. And actually we have had that a few times in our previous labs as well. For example, when we blogged about a story that someone shared with us, it sparked like new fire into an old neighborhood fight, really. So other people came to us and said, "Oh, I read this on the blog, and this is about me. I don't want that." You know, so you have all these ethical things that may happen. Or we spoke to someone who was in debt, and we talked about, yeah, can't we just not help her because it's only a couple of €100 that she will need to be rid of a lot of problems. And we thought about it a lot at Kennisland. We had a discussion about it, and then eventually we decided that she could work for us as a lab participant for 10 days, and we would pay, we would give her the money to pay her debt, and she paid us back by working in our lab. So you're never quite sure which ethical dilemmas may arise, but we'll leave plenty of space and room to talk about that the coming week, and we'll see what happens here. But it's a really important step to take into account and to be as open as we can about some of the ethical dilemmas that may arise. All right, we talked a bit about a few words like social lab, lab sprint, and we talked about them and mixing them a bit. Normally when we do a social lab, it takes about 5-6 months, and we'll be at a neighborhood for about a day a week or maybe 2 days a week with the lab team. Obviously here in Hong Kong we have 8 days, so that's why we call it a lab sprint. What we will do is we'll run through the whole methodology in order for everyone who participates to experience the whole feed-forward methodology, but obviously we do it in a smaller time, so we're really going to have this intense pressure cooker week, which is going to be real cool. You might not know it yet, but it will be. And I mean, we got to be honest, we don't believe that we can change all the problems that we may come upon to the coming week. But what we do believe is that we can spark new conversations between citizens, between government officials, between researchers, between all the stakeholders involved in the neighborhood here, and that these new, maybe unusual conversations might lead to new ways of thinking, or maybe even a change in behavior, and they can lead to the tackling of like smaller problems, and eventually that might lead to tackling of bigger problems. We might do a larger lab, maybe some later time here, but for now we really believe that a lab sprint is a step along the way in creating change and impact, and hopefully it will be well, a great learning experience for all of you that you can take back with you to your work or to your university or back home or whatever. So that's basically the difference between a lab sprint and a social lab to get things out in the open. All right, yeah, so we're going to do the first lab sprint in Hong Kong. I mean, that's nice, right?
I think it's nice.
All right, no, that's good, that's good. So we talked a bit about the whole theoretical part of the lab, but we basically left one question unanswered, and that's the question, okay, what's the lab sprint about the coming week? And Wieteke will tell you a little bit about that.
Yeah, so of course our preparations were a bit different. I mean, we had a lot of email contact and we had a lot of Skype calls with sometimes a bit blurry connection, but it worked out. And it seems that from statistical data, there are two groups that we would like to focus on that seem to experience problems. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, the difficult thing with statistical data is that you have numbers. So you can see that, for example, there are a lot of suicides among elderly, or there are a lot of people living out on the streets. But what you do not know when you're looking at those numbers is, why is that? What's the reason behind those numbers? And that's what we want to find out. And that's also why we came up with two really broad, open questions. And they might frighten you a bit because they're really open and really broad. So when we're conducting interviews with storytellers, with citizens outside, obviously, you want to ask them, how do you feel about living here? What do you think of the district? What does your life look like? And that might be really open at first, and maybe you're afraid that people don't know what to tell you. And if they don't know, that's okay, because then you can ask them more specific questions. But the idea behind those open questions is that we do not want to tell people what they think that we think is important. We want to tell them the things that they think are important to themselves. So that's why we start with those really open questions.
Right, one last break. We've got a couple of minutes left, so.
Okay, so Ada, you already did a lot. I mean, we already saw the core team. We already saw the experienced team, so that is great. And also, we hope that some stakeholders will be there on the second open class on Saturday. And maybe also during the week on Wednesday, we have a huge collaborative evaluation. So it would be really great if some stakeholders would show up there and talk to us about what's happening in our lab sprint. And lastly, of course, we have the partners here. Oh, sorry, I'm still. What is happening is that we will share our stories, as I said, on a blog that's publicly available, and we will do it via Medium because it's one of the easiest ways to blog for team members. So you can follow our blog, and we will, yes, that's the link. We will also, what are we gonna do? Yeah. Okay, so you can write it down. That's the best way, I guess. It's a bit of a long link, but that's what Medium does. I can't help it. But you can follow our stories during the whole week on this blog.
And in the workshops, we pay plenty of attention on how to write a good blog and how to post it. But hopefully, during the week, even if you're not participating in the core group or the experience group, you can follow everything we do the next week, and we try to be as open, as inclusive as we can. And you can also follow the Twitter hashtag. If anyone wants to tweet, please use the hashtag, and we can use it as a as a storyboard as well to see what happens the next week. So I think just in time, this was our talk, and thank you very much so far. And we're really looking forward to hear more about the neighborhood in the next talk, even though it's in Cantonese, but we'll find out. Perfect.